Hey guys, don't forget to check out the Street Cop Training Conference 2023, April 23rd through the 28th, Nashville, Tennessee, the Gaylord at Opry. What a center, what a place. We have amazing speakers, amazing training, 5 of the most impactful days of your career. Check it out at streetcop.com. You do not want to miss out. There is a room code available for a discounted room. Sign up now at streetcop.com.
111, 110.
Training to be a street cop.
Hey guys, welcome to this episode of the Street Cop Training Podcast. I'm your host, founder, and CEO of Street Cop Training. My name is Dennis Benino, and today with me, an author. I don't want to say clinical psychologist because she'll correct me. We've been through this before. We're going to be giving relationship advice for law enforcement. Code for Blue is the website, correct?
Code for couples.
Code for couples, which is really cool. Where does the code 4 come from?
Code 4, as in run it. So code 3, lights and sirens, everything's an emergency, right? Code 4 was everything's copacetic. I'm good. I'm cool.
Oh, wow, you're a marketing genius too, on top of being a therapist. You're a licensed counselor.
Licensed professional counselor. Yes.
Okay,
you could
cool.
just call me a psychotherapist. We're all like a cluster of therapy. And so you can say that if you wanted to.
Give us your 60 to 90 second who you are and familiarize yourself with, or we'll let the community get to know who you are.
So I'm a licensed professional counselor in Denton, Texas, have a group practice in Denton, specialize with working with first responders and specifically law enforcement as far as mental health and couples, both. I started Code for Couples because I started to realize that there was a lot of struggles in relationships. I have been married to my law enforcement husband for 22 years. And on year 13, I was going crazy. I was crying by myself alone because I wanted to be that supportive wife and not let him know that I was struggling. But it caused a lot of distance between the two of us. I was getting frustrated and kind of hitting a wall because the department was always first and I was not, and didn't understand what was going on. Thought I understood law enforcement culture. Come to find out, I really didn't. And so along the way, I started researching and figuring it out myself, because what was working in my therapy room for couples was not working for my relationship. And so I started to figure out what was underneath all of that and do my own research. And then kind of realized maybe some of the skills I had helped to keep our relationship together, but there was a connection that needed to be had there. And so that's when I founded Code for Couples, to try to impact other law enforcement relationships, officers, to help them educate what was going on with them as far as spouses, help them educate what was going on, like the psychological and emotional impact and how it spills over into the relationship, and helping them to have education and also resilience. I always say my goal is to keep your relationship connected and resilient, because relationships are the number one resilience factor for law enforcement. So, hey, we're a team. So that's how I founded Code 4, wrote the book, have the podcast. That's me.
Why do you think you couldn't help your own relationship as you were helping others? Is that common?
So a big part of it is there is a psychological underpinning that comes along with the job. You're conditioned as an officer to act a certain way, to do certain things, and your brain gets conditioned to respond in a certain way. I commonly say officers are trained to or conditioned to react and not to respond. You go do, the doing and keeping any kind of pause causes potential danger. So there's a lot of psychological underpinning and conditioning that goes along with the job. When I was at a conference, I figured something was going on because my husband wasn't acting the same way with me that I could with other individuals in my office. Some of the skills that I would use and I was taught to use with couples just didn't seem to match up. And so I was like, something's different here, but I didn't know what. And it wasn't until I went to a conference, one of my counseling conferences, and we had a keynote speaker of a veteran who was talking about PTSD, but then specifically he was talking about the fight or flight response. And he was talking about what I now know as Cooper's colors, but at the time I didn't know there was actually a name for it. And I was like, this is really interesting. And then he mentioned the OODA loop. And I was listening to that and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what my husband does all the time. And I texted him and I said, honey, do you OODA? And he texted me back and said, where the hell are you? I was like, I'm at a conference. And I was telling him, he was like, yes, I OODA. I'm like, information that would have been helpful for me to understand. Because the receiving side as a spouse is that you're doing the OODA loop thing. You're not giving me eye contact. You're not looking at me. So my assumption is you're not listening to me. You're more interested in the waitress walking by or who's walking in the door or whatever else is going on than talking to me. And that's some of the thing that impacted my relationship. Another aspect that impacted my relationship was the idea that he wanted to help me be safe. Right? He was concerned about me leaving the office late at night. He's on duty. He doesn't know when I'm home or not. I saw it as control. And it wasn't until later that I was like, oh, you're concerned about safety and you can't protect me when you're on the job. So thus you want me to check in. Whereas I was taking that check in as like, why you got to always know where I am? So there were a lot of different aspects to this that the underpinning and his needs, he wasn't aware of them. And it wasn't until we got into the research that he started to go, oh, yeah, that's right. But nobody was there to tell us. And so we had to figure it out.
How did you solve it ultimately? Was it an open conversation like when you're talking about now, or these unlocks? And that's the cool thing about therapists is like, you're like, oh, okay. Now I know why I shit with the door open, right? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, those
so
aha
how did you
moments.
resolve it? Or do you say solve or heal? Which one is it?
Oh, I don't think it's a solve. I think it's a solve. I don't think it's a heal. I always call them like aha moments. To me, I think of them as like giant puzzle pieces coming into the middle of something and going, oh, that's what this picture is, as opposed to, in that situation, which we're talking about, it wasn't about healing something. Healing comes later. It was more of an awareness of what was really going on underneath the surface. Like we're always aware of those. I'm aware of shift work. I'm aware of that he sleeps. I'm aware of my annoyance that I have to do housework and at 7:00 at night when he's gone, or keep everybody quiet. Right. So I'm aware of those things. It was all of these other aspects that we weren't aware of. So they were aha moments for me. And there was nothing out there that I saw that explained any of this to me. It was me finding Gil Martin's book at some point in time. That was probably 2015, 16. I was 15 years into being a spouse. My husband had never read it. He said, oh, I think I got that book and I put it in my desk drawer. I mean, so there was these aspects of like that there was some information available. Ellen Kirschman's book, I Love a Cop, had some information in there, but it focused on trauma. And I love that book. I like Gil Martin's book. I have notes in Gil Martin's book of like, oh, this makes sense to me now. There's also that connection for me of understanding what's important for a relationship and what makes a connected, intimate relationship. And that's something that other people don't have. And so just putting my knowledge together with the research I've read, the books I was reading, that's what kind of helped me connect the pieces together.
So once you understood it, you could start understanding how to address it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So when I started to understand what was happening, I have two models that I really look at. One of them is Dr. John Gottman, who you may have heard of. He's like,
I've read the book.
Oh, awesome. So, Gottman has this research on what makes couples work. And so I'm trained in his method. And so taking each of those pieces of what makes couples connected and intimate.
Gottman trained. It was my topic to talk to you about. Gottman trains.
Yes. So knowing all that information, I can go through it and go, well, that's impacted. Well, that's impacted. Well, that's impacted. So that was really helpful. And to look at how do we change the mindset or the understanding of that? How do we work to have the communication that we need to have? How do we work to have that intimacy? And by intimacy, I mean closeness. I don't mean just sex, but intimacy of you opening up about a hard day. That's not something as an officer I want you to go around and do on the job, because that doesn't keep you psychologically safe. When you come home or you have people that you trust, it helps to get it out. It releases some toxins. So I looked at that, and then I looked at Brene Brown's model of intimacy and what it takes to have an intimate relationship, Sue Johnson's model of what it takes to have an intimate relationship. So looking at these models that I had in counseling and then matching them up and see how they're all jacked up with what happens in law enforcement, and then for spouses as well. I mean, we have our own things in the sense of like, I'm supposed to be strong, quote unquote. And so that means I have to be tough and not talk about what's bothering me. So it's both sides.
I'm hearing that you believe that vulnerability is a key ingredient in a healthy relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. Vulnerability is so necessary. And let me define that a little bit, because sometimes that gets overused. So Brene defines that as emotional risk and exposure. So if I think about this as in a relationship, a lot of times we want to preserve the way that we want to be seen by our spouse. So I want to be seen as, I'll just take me for an example. I want to be seen as supportive. So I didn't want him to know I was struggling because I didn't want to be a burden on him. And I wanted to appear as strong, quote unquote. And so I didn't share. And so the intimacy aspect is taking the risk to share what's really going on. And that's something that in our relationships, many times we don't do, because we want to have the time together. We want to have positive. We want to stay connected. We want to make good memories because we don't know what's going to happen. Sharing those risks, those emotional risks, as an officer, being seen as somebody who struggled with a call or struggling with administration can be a risk to somebody that you hold in high regard. So intimacy, it winds up being with people that we really care about, not just, somebody that we really don't.
If someone is hurt when being vulnerable, so they open themselves up, they let themselves be vulnerable, and it's actually like just slammed right back in their face, do you find that to be impactful for the future of future relationships?
Oh, hell yeah. Yes, for sure. I mean, it's kind of like, well, if I stick my hand out and you smack it, why am I going to stick my hand out again? And that is exactly it. That's why it's really important to understand and maybe even say, hey, this is really difficult for me to talk about. And I'm needing to make sure that we can sit and really have a conversation about it. It can feel a little bit like somebody running out naked in a field if you don't let people know, like, hey, this is hard for me, or set up a scene or a situation. So if I just randomly blurt something out, it might be off-putting, or I might not have the mental capacity to listen to you at the moment, or I might not know what to do. I had a faux pas of this in our relationship. At some point in time, I don't know, it was 16, 17 years in, my husband was running a situation, a rifle qualification. They had just set up rifle school, and he was in charge of the quals, and he was running it, and had set up a protocol based upon what he had been trained on. And he set up this protocol, had gotten some mentoring for people, and the chief approved it. And this probably would have been 15 years in, but chief approved it, ran everybody through the quals, and only 2 people passed. And the chief blamed my husband for making it too difficult. And he was already tired. He was overworked. He felt really stressed about this new program. And I witnessed him being because he got pissed first, came home pissed. And then we're sitting on the porch, having a bourbon probably, and talking to each other. And he starts talking and my husband does not cry. And I saw that thing in his eyes. And I'm like, oh God, I don't know what to do with this. What do I do? He's getting emotional. And I think I was probably fortunate that I do that for a living, because if not, I would have tried to probably fix it for him and kind of like get back in that space that I know I want you to be. For spouses, for me, it was kind of like, get back up on that white horse. I need you to be on that white horse. Don't be vulnerable. And so, yes, it definitely hurts, because if I would not have been in a space where I wanted to talk or when I wanted to listen or heard him, then it definitely causes injury for sure. And that's not just in law enforcement relationships, that's in all relationships.
Does someone's life experiences leading up to being asked to be vulnerable affect their ability to be vulnerable? So, for example, I'm pretty open with things in my life. I'm been labeled a survivor. So I would imagine that somebody who's in similar circumstances like me, and I think a lot of times people who are law enforcement officers probably have the same clinical, I don't want to say diagnosis, but analysis of survivorship in some sense. It's probably what drives us to law enforcement, because we want to help others and we are compassionate and empathetic to people trying to survive their situations. Do you think that affects somebody's ability to be vulnerable?
Absolutely. So research, there's actually some research out there that I think it's slightly over 50% of all law enforcement officers have some type of trauma before they even go into the field. And many times that trauma is what drives them to become who they are. And so whatever trauma that is, whether that's abuse, whether that was bullying, and so many times that's what happens, is that I want to go and make this better for other people. I want to protect people. And so our messages to ourselves, many times, how we kept ourselves safe, many times impacts how we go forward in our relationships. So if for me,
Learned behavior.
Right. And learned behavior. So one of the things that I did was, if I learn to be quiet and don't tell, why would I open up? If I am shamed for who I was growing up, or shamed for a situation growing up, or I feel shame, because shame is what keeps us quiet. Shame is the thing. I always think of it as like the leftovers that you brought home from the restaurant in the back of the fridge, and it starts to something starts to smell and the milk tastes funny. And it's that stuff that's left in the back of the fridge. And if we don't take care of that shame will prevent us from showing up. It causes our hustle. And so what I do, or what other people do too, is they overcompensate. And so I'm going to appear as strong. I'm going to overfunction. It doesn't really impact me because I'm not wanting to appear as what many of us see as weak. The mindset, is that what you're thinking? The mindset.
I'm pointing at myself.
Oh, you're pointing at yourself. You're like,
yeah.
It's me. Yes. So that is exactly what impacts our ability to be open and vulnerable. We're concerned about how other people are going to see us. And as much as we can say, I don't give a shit what people think about us, we do care what people think about us. And because we're human, we want to be liked. But it's how we see ourselves and whether or not we're willing to be authentic and own our own story. A lot of it's that, like, I want to pretend that that's not a part of who I am. We many times see it as a way of the way we're defined, as opposed to seeing it as something that we've moved through and it's a part of our journey and who we are. And yes, it's maybe shaped us, but it doesn't define us. And so many times we're running away from that shame.
Do you think there is a line between being authentic, which you could explore that, what authenticity means, versus wearing a mask? and how often do you think we're actually being authentic versus wearing masks? I would actually argue that most of the time, 99% of the time, we're wearing masks, no matter who you are. Authenticity, according to a person that I consider to be my guru, Seth Godin, is a crock. Because if you're authentic, you wouldn't get out of bed, you would watch TV all day. But, and I'll give you an example. I came into work one morning, and I'm very, very fortunate to have very good EQ. Matter of fact, if I'm ever feeling emotional, I can actually step out of my brain and go, look what you're going through today, right? Like, you're feeling emotional. Be aware of that. And that my kids want to play. And I'm like, okay, I know that you want to like literally just go to bed and wake and sleep it off till tomorrow. But like, they're your children and they want to play with their dad, and lashing out at them is not going to help them. They don't understand at their young age that you are not in a good mood right now. And I'm very rarely in a bad mood. I've had a very taxing year this year. And for a lot of people on the surface of street cop training and the amount of attention we have, this is what I hear all the time. You guys are fucking killing it, man. Like, they know you everywhere. You're in other countries. Like, I acknowledge that. Thank you for that as well. But a lot of things we don't air on the other side of things is the BS we have to put up here and deal with constantly on an everyday basis. And then you come in one day and you're like, oh, cool. I'm feeling good. I'm going to be productive today. All these cool ideas that we have, we're going to get them into the world. We're going to save lives. And all of a sudden, some dumb shit comes up. Mm-hmm. And, it hinders the progression of the day. Now, that's the preamble to this story, the preface. I come into work one day and I was late, and my VP and the other head of staff here, they said, I'm sorry I'm late. I'm the owner, but I still apologize for it. I'm sorry I'm late. I had a very difficult morning, and I explained why, and they realized that I was going through something. And I said, well, you got a podcast in 10 minutes. We'll just reschedule it. I went, no, we do the fucking podcast. Right? I'm a professional. Like, I'm a professional. So the mask goes on. I can actually control what that felt like, step away from it, put the mask on, and appear authentic. My heart and my soul's authentic. What I'm doing for the world is authenticity, because it's how I feel like I'm contributing in this somewhat God-given ability to contribute. But, I don't think the world wants authenticity the whole time, because if I was authentic that morning, I go, yeah, fuck this. I'm going home. So back to the original question. Tell me about authenticity versus wearing masks.
So I think authenticity is a journey. I don't think it's a destination. I think that we are trying to be congruent with who we want to be, who we are. I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, we all have responsibilities. We have things that we need to do. And some of it is but authenticity is kind of trying to be as true to ourselves, being honest. I think authenticity involves being honest with ourselves. And some of that honesty is like, man, I am in a rotten space right now. I have a job to go do, and so I'm going to do my job. But I think there's authenticity in knowing that, hey, I've got to go turn it on right now, because this is what I'm going to do. And authenticity in knowing that, hey, when I get done, I need to go handle something else. So I think I totally understand I'm doing my air quotes thing, that authenticity, I think vulnerability, those are two words that are very overused right now over the last couple of years, for sure. When we're talking about a mask, I'm going to circle it back around to relationships, if you don't mind. When we're talking about a mask, it's, are we being congruent with our partner in the sense of like, I'm struggling, or I'm really wanting this, or I'm needing this? Are we being honest and congruent with who we want to be? Are our actions matching up to what type of relationship we want? I think that's what we're looking at. So if I go back to my story that I had as far as my journey, I was wearing a mask a lot because I did not talk to my husband about my struggles. I did not talk to him about some of my trauma growing up. I didn't talk to him about what it was like for me on the other end. So all of those things were a mask, because I'm like, our relationship's great. And he'll even tell you, I mean, if he was here, he'd be like, I had no clue there was anything wrong with our relationship. I thought you were just fine. And I'm like, oh no, I was seething. I I didn't tell you shit. But that authenticity, when we're talking about a relationship, that leads to intimacy. So authenticity is going to be, I'm going to be real in the sense that I'm going to tell you what's really bothering me, but you don't do that in a way that is harmful, hurtful. And gosh, don't pop quiz me on this, but there is an acronym where it's kind of like, is it true? Is it kind? Does it promote some kind of change? Like really thinking about authenticity isn't a matter of like, I'm going to tell you that you suck. I mean, to me, that's not authenticity. To me, it's like, I'm going to be authentic and understand, like, maybe I need to have a boundary here. But in our relationships with each other, being authentic, I think, means when you have that vulnerability aspect, I'm talking about the real feelings, my real needs, and not trying to just fake it throughout the whole entire relationship or wear a mask.
What would you say if somebody was being vulnerable, but the partner isn't receptive or isn't compassionate or have empathy for that person? Do you think that sometimes a partner could be in a bad place themselves?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So actually, that's a really good one, especially in our relationships.
I'm good at this shit, Cyndi. Yeah, there it is.
So,
that's a good one.
That is absolutely what happens, right? So, and I still, my husband and I have been working on this for a couple of years, and it still happens because I'll bring something up, and he looks at me and goes, "Okay." I'm like, "No, that's the wrong answer." I'm like, so I try to give him grace and say, what I'm needing is this, and I tell him what it is. Most of that is because he's, as law enforcement, I'll circle back around to that. In law enforcement, I don't want you to go around and have a crap ton of empathy for everybody that you work with. Kind of moving away from that empathy is what keeps you safe. Otherwise, you'd be feeling all the things, and that'd be really bad. So deciding to come home and, I'm now going to put out this empathy. I mean, empathy is a skill. It's not something that we're not born with empathy. We're taught empathy, right?
Yeah, right.
And
I think everything's that way. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I mean,
people who are, I guess some comes back to genetics, but I try to use my grandmother as an example of who I try to be like. God rest her soul. This woman was not only funny and charismatic. I never heard her say a bad word about anybody. And anytime I was born in lower middle class, blue collar, completely, now looking back as an adult, like absolutely ridiculous behavior being surrounded by, stuff that I'm just like, Jesus Christ, like, how was it okay for us to do that? How is it okay for us to see that? And every kid in my neighborhood was the same way, just that kind of environment. My grandmother would correct behavior and say things like, it sounds like you're very judgmental, and that's not. And this is not a trained woman. This is a woman who grew up in Little Italy, New York. Didn't know people spoke English. She thought they only spoke Italian until she was like 7 years old. And, just had so much compassion for everybody, but was still very, very funny, but never said a bad word. If you made we even regard her now. If you made she was into cooking and baking. If you would have screwed something up, she would pretend to go, it's actually not that bad as you think it is. And then she would like make a joke about it. But I just think about how she saw the world.
Yeah.
How did she ever figure that out in the kind of environment she grew up in? Italian immigrant family, to be able to perceive things that way was a superpower. So when I look at my behavior, I'm like, what would my grandmother be doing right now? The only person I know in my life that actually has that kind of superpower. Very hard. You have to practice it. You can learn it. And it's very powerful.
Yes. And that when we're talking about having those intimate conversations or opening up and being vulnerable, and when somebody's not ready to receive it, or if they don't understand, what do I do with it? So I'm going to bring in some of that conditioning too. So as law enforcement, what do you do all day? You fix other people's problems. And so in my relationship, I would bring something up and my husband would think he needed to fix it. And if he couldn't fix it, he just got pissed. Because that frustrated him. He wanted to protect me. He wanted to, right? So these same kind of ideas of who he is as a person. And so he still struggles with empathy. He's not perfect. He tries.
That's good.
And the
That's
whole
good that he
idea is to
tries.
try, right? So when I'm working with people and I'm teaching them the flip side of like, how do you take this piece of information that's very vulnerable for somebody to share and not shut it down? And empathy doesn't have to be hard. It's as easy as like, okay, if I was in that situation, that would feel like blank. And if somebody can just do that and say, that would be really sad, that's enough. Like that's enough for somebody to do and for somebody to go like, yes, thanks for hearing me. I mean, and that's all there has to be. It's just a matter of when somebody says something vulnerable is allowing them to be seen and heard. And it does not have to be fixed. But in our culture, it's about fixing a problem. And I would say even on the flip side, and I would say a lot of people want to just fix problems. They don't know how to just listen to feeling. But if you're wanting people to be vulnerable, if you're wanting to create greater intimacy between people, to feel more connected between people, then you have to just be willing to listen to the feeling and help them feel seen in a certain way.
Seen, validated, heard. That struck a chord with you?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Very much
How does
so.
someone learn to see, hear, and validate others? How does somebody learn that? Through practice?
Yes. I would also say, you were just talking about your grandmother and you were talking about her story, and you were kind of sitting there and you're like, I am so amazed by her story because this is her story. And really that's kind of the whole journey, is learning and listening to hear somebody else's story and connect to their story. So there's no perfect way to make people, and I tell that to people in therapy, is that there's no perfect way. I'm not going to edit your language. You could say, that's some bullshit. And I'd be like, great. Does that make somebody feel seen? Yeah, that makes me totally feel seen. Right. So it's really just about hearing their story. In my book, what I talk about is standing in somebody else's shoes. How do you stand in somebody else's shoes? What would that be like? And so when you're talking about heard, seen, validation, empathy, I could get technical and be like, well, this is a validating answer. This is an empathy answer. But really, it's just about how can I see your journey through your eyes? And the shoes scenario is the best one that I have.
Would you consider vulnerability to be a superpower? And I'll just take it from a leadership perspective, right? Like I'm just going to jump in here and add this in. Let's give an example of why I think it's a superpower. Let's just take a chief. Chief gives an order. The chief is willing to listen to why his order was possibly wrong. And people are willing to know that or are under the assumption that they know that they can go back to the chief and say, hey, we don't think this is right. Here's why. So that happens to me here as a leader of this organization. I have a lot of employees and we have a lot of instructors, significantly sized. Nobody here has a problem with coming to me and saying, we don't agree with this. And I go, I'm all ears. I'd like to hear why. It's very rare that I take out the mallet, slam the thing down and go, I know this is right. I know it sounds fucking nuts. It's rare. I have to do it sometimes, and I haven't missed yet on that one. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm 100% right now. I'm batting 1,000 on those. This is what we're doing. I'm telling you that it may sound crazy to you, but a lot of times I'm like, oh yeah, that, you're right. So that's my vulnerability here as a leader of an organization, as the top boss. I don't let people call me the boss around here, and I don't like people introducing me as their boss. We work together. We're under an agreement.
The same thing.
Yeah, you get paid for money. I need your services. There's obviously an economic exchange here. I'm obviously getting a good return on my investment. I care about you tremendously. I'm here for you. If I don't think you belong in this organization, obviously we don't have anything further to do. But if I think that you're the right person, I'm going to invest in you so heavily, not just financially, but emotionally and as a friend, and really care and think about your life, who you are, what you need from me. And everybody here needs something different. Everybody here needs something different. And I'm willing to cater to that. Some people say, well, you did it for her, but you didn't do it for him. I go, well, him doesn't want that. That's what she wants. Him wants to drive a Mercedes. That's a different thing.
Absolutely.
Anyway, vulnerability, superpower. Now go.
I can see that. I think vulnerability takes a lot of understanding your own self-worth and being comfortable with who we are. It takes a lot of continually working on ourselves, continually challenging ourselves. Vulnerability.
Willing to take that, like willing to know the risk of vulnerability and what that could mean detrimentally for you.
Absolutely. And I think it's also because vulnerability in itself, like I haven't said this to you, vulnerability is it's full contact, right? So just like shame is a full contact emotion, we feel it. It is a fight or flight response. And so that vulnerability aspect comes from challenging our fight or flight response, because not everything is vulnerability. Sometimes sometimes something's vulnerable initially, but because we've done it over and over again, it's no longer vulnerable. So you listening to your staff and listening to these problems may be not as vulnerable as it first was, because you continually work and you have beliefs that go along with that. So I can say vulnerability could be a superpower. I would also say that anybody can grow into vulnerability. I think it takes willingness to listen and to sit and to, connect to people. I think there's different ways of looking at that superpower for sure.
Is there a balance between vulnerability and being guarded? You think it's sometimes safer to be a little guarded? I would argue that it is.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because vulnerability, once again, vulnerability is a choice. I think I don't run around and elicit vulnerability with every single person, because I don't want to have that type of relationship. Not everybody has earned that right for me to be vulnerable with them. And so I may be vulnerable with one person and share something, but then if somebody else comes in, I'm going to go, okay, and I'm going to have boundaries or react accordingly. Sometimes we are thrust into situations where it kind of elicits some vulnerability. We definitely protect ourselves. We have shields that armor ourselves, naturally from vulnerability. We can look at Brené's research. We can look at John Gottman. They sync up. Brené actually looked at John Gottman and was like, there's validation, because our reaction to being to vulnerability can be to move away, move toward, or move against. I call it shrink, dance, puff up. And so if I am not in a space, if somebody tries to hurt me in some way, or I feel that shame come up, or that comparison or the scarcity come up, if I feel some of that come up, then my body is naturally going to do one of those three things. And even in doing our own work or your work or my work, there's probably some of those times where somebody says something and there's a little bit like inside where it kind of hurts. And then you choose to move through it differently. And that, I think, is moving through and into that vulnerability. But I think protecting ourselves from vulnerability and choosing to be vulnerable in certain situations is really, some of it's a choice and some of it's, a biological reaction.
Do you think people can learn to become more emotionally intelligent if they try?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It takes a willingness. It takes an uncomfortableness.
People don't want to go to that uncomfortable level. Is that what it is usually?
Yeah, that's usually what it is. Even in my therapy room, sometimes where I'll have a couple and somebody will be sharing something and they'll hear it. I think law enforcement, I'll spin it back around to that really quickly. I think sometimes when, as a spouse, if I share something with my officer about the impact on the job, I really miss you, I'm alone, gosh, you're getting on called out all the time, you're having to cover shifts all the time. And many times what officers hear is, you're not enough, you're not doing enough. And instead, what it's really about is just listening to what that other person says. So in my office, people get defensive and I'll say, hold on. just listen to what they're saying. And our body's wired to become defensive. And so it takes a little extra step to want to sit in that uncomfortable feeling of, wow, you feel really alone. Because there's also, I'm going to tag it to our jobs, there's also this aspect of like, and that's because of my job. And that's because of the career that we chose to have together. Right. So that's the uncomfortable part. And people many times don't want to hear those uncomfortable emotions because they feel responsible. And also the EQ of like owning your own emotions and where you are. So absolutely.
What's a good piece of advice, maybe even a universal piece of advice that you think applies to a majority of police officers or in an effort to establish and keep a good relationship? What is that one piece of advice that you could say, if you guys just try to do this a little bit more, you may have more success in your relationships? And you've got to recognize that it's universal, but it really applies to law enforcement.
Yeah, I have a couple. And the first one I'll say is perspective taking. So being willing to take the perspective of another person. So you mentioned earlier about your children and how they want to play with you. And you took perspective. You were like, you know what? They're kids. They don't understand I'm tired. They just want to connect with me. They love me. They miss me. Right. So you took the perspective of the other person. And if we can learn to take the perspective of the other person, even if sometimes we're like, I don't get it. Right. I don't understand what's going on. Even if you're like, okay, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from and I'm struggling here, then that is so monumental, because that can, and it goes for spouses too, right? So I'm going to take the perspective of what are you walking into? What's it like for you? And so that perspective taking is 100% the biggest piece of advice I could give. The second one I would give to a lot of people is to understand that we understand that what happens on the job comes home many times. It's hard to prevent that. If you can remember the person that you want to show up as in the relationship, who is the person? Who do you want to be as far as a spouse? Who do you want to be as far as a parent? And check in with yourself on a regular basis. Are you demonstrating that? You're not going to be perfect in any sense of the word. If you are checking in with yourself, what you wind up doing is kind of directing your own compass and guiding you to where you want to be, as opposed to the job kind of knocking you off track and the impact being so great later on that you're far away from the person that you want to be. And that would be for both sides of the fence.
Miscommunication is usually a significant factor of many problems. Would you think it's a wise idea to encourage communication amongst couples? And if so, how would somebody go about doing that?
That's a big question. Yeah, I would say the big part of miscommunication is that we're hearing things through our own filters. And most of the time, what we're not looking for communication. We're looking for connection. So communication is, I can direct you. Do we really need to work on understanding how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich better? No. What we need to do is we need to be heard and seen and understood. And so when we're communicating, sometimes when we're coming from those different perspectives, what I recommend is looking at what do we have in common? What are we saying that's the same? And then what's the difference in what we're trying to do? Communication overall is just, especially when you incorporate like text messaging and not seeing each other and not knowing what the other person has gone through. If I don't know what kind of night or experience you've had, if you don't know as a spouse, like what kind of couple days your spouse has had, you walk into something and you get hit and you're like, you personalize what's happening. And in that communication, maybe I have tone in my voice that sounds harsh, but that's not at you. Maybe I'm just frustrated at the situation, but because I have that harshness in my tone, then you're like, oh, you're pissed at me. I'm like, no. So there's so much to unpack with communication that it's really hard to just synthesize it down into just a couple of sound bites, but I would say look for connection. Look for if you really want to make a difference, look for content and listen for content and listen for feeling.
What are some early warning signs of a relationship beginning to experience difficulties that maybe consciously people are not taking into account? Maybe give me 3 or 4 of early warning signs of, maybe somebody's listening that says, hook, we're doing that right now. Holy shit. And maybe what's the solution to some of that stuff?
So the first thing I would say is that if you are not aware of what is going on in your spouse's world, right? So you don't know who their friends are, you don't know what they're annoyed about at work or the kids, that you're not plugged into their Gottman calls it a love map. If you're not plugged into what's going on in their world, that's going to be a problem, because what starts happening is that people start turning toward other people and sharing with other people. And that can open doors and windows. So if I don't know what's going on in my spouse's world, or if I am turning towards somebody else, if I'm talking to somebody else about things that are bothering me and not my spouse, that would be an indicator. So if there's somebody that, and it happens inadvertently, but if you realize that you're not able, or you're not talking to your spouse, or that your spouse is not talking to you or willing to talk to you, that's a problem. Just about daily life. I would say the other thing, physical touch is really important, especially in our relationships. And many times we forget to touch just for the sake of touch. So we're touching, and women become conditioned in particular that the man is touching the woman just because they want sex. And it's not, women will say, oh, sex isn't important to me. That's crap. Sex is important to all of us.
I'll agree with that. I've done that a few times. I could tell it's important to them too.
Yeah. So what happens is that though, if you're just touching me or kissing me because you want sex, then I'm going to reject that. So it's important to touch hair, hug, grab ass, do whatever you want or need to do, but make sure that touch is just a regular part of your relationship. So I liken it to brownies a lot of times. Like if you didn't have a brownie for a really long time, you're going to be like, brownies, right? And so as women, we also need to remember to touch, to give massages, to give you a kiss. Those kinds of things are really important as far as physical touch. The last thing I would say is, do you express admiration for your partner? Are you feeling valued in your relationship? And are you expressing value to the other person? Not just a matter of like, thanks for taking out the trash, but more about, you know what? I really admire how hard you work. I admire your integrity. I admire your sense of humor. I admire, thanks for keeping things funny. My husband he likes to like make voices for the animals. He makes up lyrics to different songs that are inappropriate. And there are times where I'm like, ugh, and I roll my eyes, but then I have to remember his sense of humor is one of the things that I fell in love with. And after we've been together 24 years, but married 22. But after all that time, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, do we really have to sing about butts again? Or, whatever he's going to make up. But his sophomoric humor is part of what I fell in love with. And so I have to remember that and appreciate that humor, even though sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh. So part of that is really keeping in mind, like, am I showing admiration? Am I expressing appreciation for my partner? And so it's a giving and receiving on both ends.
It's been brought to my attention from one of our clinicians, Hannah Heyman, who works with the company directly, that she always tells couples to try to find somebody who you can grow with. And a lot of times around a little later on, 8-10 years on, that they're growing in different ways. How would you try to align yourself with somebody who's going to grow with you as people continue to change every 8 or 10 years? And how important is the love factor behind that?
I think that we all grow, and we all, hopefully, like, we're all changing, and not everybody wants to have introspection. It's interesting that you're asking that question because many times clinicians are like, why do we always have to get more into, why do we always have to grow? Because as clinicians, what we have to do is like, we can only take our clients as far as we're willing to go. And so maybe somebody's taken on a new hobby. Maybe they're, part of that is like the emotional growth. And then other parts of it might also be growth as far as, hobbies or making new friends, changing. So I think what's important is when you're talking about as a couple going through this is talking about why things are important, talking about what you're learning. It's pretty rare, honestly, for people, if you're communicating about what's important and sharing what you're learning and keeping your spouse in the loop, I think it's pretty rare for people to get so far off track that they can't appreciate the growth of the other individual. Many times what happens is that maybe somebody will go through some emotional growth. Maybe they've gone through their own therapy, they've had their own aha moments, and then the other person is unwilling to also have some of those growth moments. And that's probably the more, that's probably more conflictual for couples. So to not be able to have a flexible mindset to learn from each other and grow in that way.
I have one more question, and then we're going to go into where can they find Cyndi Doyle. But here's my question, and I think it's a good last question. I've seen this on several occasions. You are now experiencing a spouse with mental issues or experiencing a significant trauma in their life, what has now altered the mood or the personality of the person that you're married to. And sometimes it doesn't seem like it's resolving at all, and it's not going away. What do we do in these scenarios?
That is a great question. And I would also say that is a great segue into me talking about resilience. Many times we do experience injuries of some kind, whether that's a physical injury, whether that's a psychological injury, especially in this job or career field, right? In this world. And so what we have to understand is that things aren't always going to be the way they are, that there are going to be changes, that question prior, like people changing in different ways. And what we have to look at is, first of all, there needs to be some grief. There's a grief and a loss of what you had. So if somebody's changed personality wise, if somebody is struggling with like post-traumatic stress injury or been traumatized by what they've experienced on either side, then it's grieving what was, accepting what is, and then deciding, where do we go from here? Mm-hmm. So resilience, we all have injuries. And so we can move through those injuries. We just have to look and see like, okay, well, what does this mean for us? Well, how does this change? What do we need to do now? How do we need to adjust? How can I still connect with you? What's meaningful to you now? And couples can go through that. I've worked with couples that have gone through shootings together or officer involved shootings.
At each other?
Not at each other, gotcha. But or deaths, and so these impacts or the traumas that are experienced. And I think also, we look at the way the world is now and the impact on the relationship, the impacts on the officers and the spouses and our relationships. And so we can grieve that. And then we can also move through it. I think of like a tree that has been struck by lightning. That doesn't mean they don't continue to grow. It just grows differently.
It's very interesting. And I think that you've really unlocked a lot of real good knowledge. And before I ask where they can find you, I have so much more to do with you. I think we're friends. I will give you a compliment that I can't believe that based on the years that you're giving me and how long you've been together, you must have some amazing skin routine because you're just glowing, sister.
get that a lot. I get like, your skin is so glowy. I'm like, I take care of it.
It's good. Your teeth are fucking white as shit. Well, that doesn't make any sense. They're white as pearls, right? Like I get next podcast, I'm going to wear a sunglasses because my eyes are hurting from those white teeth. But I think that taking the time today to address the law enforcement community, now I don't want to date myself as far as these podcasts goes because they're going to be historic and monumental in time. But we are to the over 370,000 subscribers to this podcast. So
it's amazing.
There's a big outreach. Thank you. To all the people that can hear you and what it means for you to take the time out of your day to come on here and provide value. Sitting next to my brother-in-law at the moment, and this way he'll be able to brag to his friends that he was here on his podcast episode. But as you talked, I know that he is early in his marriage and he's early in the career. And this is probably really good advice for him to hear. And he's shaking his head, yes, you can't say it. It just goes to show you when you know something that can help people and you show up and you say, hey, you know what? I'm vulnerable. I'm opening myself up. This is what I know. Maybe it'll help you. Maybe it won't. But it would be a disservice to the world if I kept it to myself. It means a lot to a lot of people. Now, some people might hear this and go, I don't care. That's okay. You don't have to. It's not for everybody. But my last question is, where can they find you? Instagram, give me your socials and your book and where they can find it on Amazon and all that jazz.
Sure. I'm on Instagram and Facebook at Code 4, and that's the number 4. So Code 4 Couples. On Instagram and Facebook. I'm probably more active on Instagram than I am Facebook. You can feel free to DM me if you have any questions. My website is the same thing, code4couples.com. I have my own podcast and all the Code 4 Couples things. The only thing different is my book, which is called Hold the Line, The Essential Guide to Protecting Your Law Enforcement Relationship. And that is on any online book retailer. So Barnes & Noble or Amazon. And I think there's a couple of other ones out there. I think it's on Walmart. And I also have a free workbook that goes along with it. It's like 72 pages of a workbook if you really want to dive into that. And that's on my website, or you can go to holdthelinebook.com and also access it there.
It's awesome. And you can do this again with me?
Sure. Be happy to.
All right. Listen, I put you on the spot. We got you recorded. All right. I'll be sending process servers to your house with paper saying you agreed to this.
I committed.
Yeah, you committed. I know that you're probably busy. Do you have any openings or availability in that area for somebody who may be struggling to come and see you, or are you booked up?
I have a few openings and availability. So I work with clients Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I do have a pretty full load, but I do, my goal is to kick you out of therapy because you're healthy. So I regularly move people through therapy. And so if you're wanting to get connect with me through therapy, you can do that too. And you can just go through Code 4 and connect with me there as well.
It's excellent. We follow you already on Instagram, but I can't thank you enough for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.